Thank you so much for being with us, Dr. Fundiswa Kobo, is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. You have to tell me if I pronounce it wrong or anything like that.
Okay.
And you're coming all the way from South Africa to us.
Yes.
Yeah, that's really exciting. And what's the weather like over there at the minute?
It's actually chilly.
Is it?
Yes, it's our winter now. Yes.
Yes. Okay. Because you can see from my clothing that it's really hot today here.
Yeah, actually, I'm like admiring you. I was like, I wish, but not with us wearing like this. It's very cold at the moment, especially inside the house. At least outside you would see a little bit of sunshine, but then still it is winter and it's cold.
Yeah. We don't really think of South Africa as being in winter, but I guess, you're in the Southern Hemisphere, so it's like in the same way that Australia and New Zealand would be cold now, I guess. It's a similar kind of idea, yeah.
Yes.
We imagine England as being always cold, don't we, really? But we seem to get more and more heat waves here. It's really very hot at the minute. Anyway, on to the interview. It's really lovely to have you with us and as part of the series. I don't know if you've seen the first three, Fundiswa, but we've had Anthony and Dwight Hopkins, Anthony Reddy, Dwight Hopkins and Evie Vernon as well on so far. So it's a very exciting series, really nice to have all these people, eminent theologians on. And you are at the University of South Africa, aren't you?
Yes.
Could you perhaps start in the way that I've been asking everyone to start, by telling us just a bit about your background and maybe how you got to where you are, how you became the lecturer. You're a lecturer, aren't you? So the lecturer that you are today.
Okay, thank you so much. First, let me take the opportunity to actually express gratitude for this space. Actually, I feel it's a life-affirming space. And also to thank Anthony for his recommendation. I did watch his interview, but I didn't get to see the second one by Dwight Hopkins. So I think I'll be able to see it as well. I wasn't sure if it was out already, but I did remember you mentioned that he'll be next. So yeah, so I'm excited to be in this space, just to engage and to also to learn, because you learn things that are happening in other parts of the world, and it indeed helps us. So yes, I'm Fundiswa Kobo. I was born and bred in the Eastern Cape in South Africa. Actually, the first 6 years of my life, actually, they are somehow interesting, because I was staying with my maternal grandmother in a rural village. I think the first 5 years, in fact. So, so it's actually in the outskirts, in the Eastern Cape, in South Africa. So, so three things that really define who we are the things that actually trace back from that first 5 years of my life at my grandmother's house. So, three things that define our family values: prayer, church, and education. So there was this, at first we really never really understood what it was, but then at home, my grandmother would wake us up at 3 a.m., between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m., like on daily basis to pray. Like 3 a.m., like as children, it really didn't make sense why this woman was praying. But then as we grew older, we got to kind of get used to it and started enjoying it and so forth, even though we didn't understand why the fast. But then somehow it became a pillar at home, waking up and praying. And also, so prayer was just like that at home. But then also on Sundays, there was this tradition that everyone must go to church, whether you want to or not. Sometimes my siblings, they were playing football. So in some instances on Sundays, they had to go and play with their teams and so forth. And in cases like that, if they did go and not go to church, our home would be locked. So they wouldn't be able to access our home during, for as long as it is still time for church service. So there was no access at home. And it really didn't make sense, but then I grew up in that kind of a home. And lastly, education. I mean, I remember when I was, I think 4 or 5, I was still at crèche, and then this other day I overslept, and my grandmother woke me up, insisted, even though I was late, because I was afraid then, because I would be like punished or whatever because of like being late. And then my grandmother dragged me literally to crèche, and then I had to go even though I didn't want to. So I grew up in that kind of space. Actually, when I reflect on it now, I laugh about it. But then there's a sense in which that environment, it influenced the person that I am today and the person that I am becoming. Because now I'm an ordained minister in the Uniting Presbyterian Church in Southern Africa. I was ordained in 2012 and served from 2012 to 2014. And then from 2014 June to 2015 June, I had an opportunity to serve in the offices of the World Communion of Reformed Churches in Hanover, in Germany. I got an internship position for a year. So, and then when I returned back to South Africa, end of June in 2015, then I enrolled for a PhD. And then during that time as well, I think in 2016, then I got a job at the University of South Africa, which is where I'm also currently still a senior lecturer in the Department of Christian Spirituality, Church History, and Missiology. So that's just basically who I am.
Mm. That sounds like you had formidable, a house with formidable women.
Yes, actually, you could say that because, for instance, I grew up the first 5 years, I was with my grandmother. At that time, my grandfather had already passed on, so my grandmother was a widow. And then I think in the 6th year, I moved to stay with my mom. My parents separated when I was very young. So basically I was raised by my mother. So I come from this background of strong women. And as a result, women speak. I grew up knowing that women speak. They must be heard, their voices must be loud, especially my mom. Actually, she has a loud voice naturally. So, I've always understood my place, that I have to speak if I do not like something, or if I do not understand, or whatever the case, I must speak. So I grew up in that kind of an environment. But then it is not what you find outside home. Home becomes male dominated in all respects, especially my own space where I am as a theologian. There's mainly male, and then you go to church, it's also a male dominated space in terms of leadership, that is not in terms of membership, because most of our churches, actually, when I think about this, especially in like Black churches, membership, you would say maybe 80% are women.
Yeah.
Yes.
There are more women in churches here as well, but I don't think it's quite 80%. Maybe more like 60, 65. But yeah, there's definitely more women in the pews, and less women in leadership, although it is changing. It is changing.
Yeah, it is changing.
How long? So you're is it the United Reformed Church that you're part of, or just
United Presbyterian?
Presbyterian, sorry. You said then Reformed, so it's just part of the Reformed family.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. In United Presbyterian. Okay. And how long have they in South Africa been ordaining women then?
It's been, I think, I'm trying to think, there was this assembly, I think our last assembly was last year or year before last. They were celebrating, I think, 20 years. They've been doing it for quite some time. Yes.
Yeah, it's been a while then.
Yeah, and also the number is increasing. At first, you could count, there were less than 5. There was 1, there was 2, there was 3, but then now at least you see there's a bit of improvement. There are a lot of women, especially now young women, who are coming and joining the church and being ordained.
Yeah. No, definitely it's changing, isn't it? You've got, many more women priests now in all denominations. Well, not all, but a lot.
Yeah.
We won't mention the ones that still don't ordain women. And so, I don't know, because you listened to Anthony's interview conversation with me, so you will have heard that we were having a chat at one point about whether you, when he was introducing you, he was wondering whether you were born completely after the time that apartheid ended, or I can't remember the word he used for that.
Born free. Actually, I laughed at that. Yes.
Yeah. What do they call the people that were born free something?
People, yes, they call them born frees. People who were born, who were born after 1994.
That's right.
That's when we had our first black president, democratic elections and so forth. So they refer to those as born frees. Actually, I laugh because I'm actually not.
No. So has he taken years off you then? Is that why you're laughing?
Sorry?
Has he taken years off you? He's made you younger.
Yes, actually, yes. I think he really made me like very young to
You'd have to be about 25 or something, wouldn't you? I think, yeah. So. 94, yeah. So, yeah. That's you'd have to be pretty young, and you would have achieved a lot for being only 24 or 5 or something, wouldn't you?
Exactly.
Yeah, because you're doing great work in the university and everything. I mean, some people are very young when they become lecturers, it's true. But you've also worked in a church before that, so I guess that,
Yes, yes, because I
that experience as well.
Yeah.
You must look very young, that's all it is, Anthony's.
I think so, because I'm also so sometimes it's confusing people.
That's great, thank you. So that's a good start. Your background, etc. Now, what have I've pinned up my questions here. So yeah, the next one I've put is, so Anthony Reddy told us that you're one of this a new generation, as he called it, of Black theologians, and one of the best, he thinks, of the new generation of Black theologians. So could you tell us a bit about who inspires you in terms of people that came before you, and also maybe a little bit about your specialist area of work?
Okay. So when I was still in the church, before I was even thinking that I would enroll for a PhD, one of the works that I was just reading was works by James Cone, one of the greatest Black theologians of our time. In fact, we regard him as one of the founders of Black theology of liberation. So I read his work a lot, but the issue is I was reading Cone at a time where I was still full-time in ordained ministry, but also at a time where actually I was seeing a lot of contradictions in my own church space. For instance, what I mentioned to you earlier, that there's women are in majority, but in leadership, it's male dominated. So men are in minority but leadership is male dominated. But also in my church, yes, blacks are in majority. That's another thing in my church, they're in majority. But I also notice, however, that there's a sense in which there's dominance of white people in leadership. Yeah. So those are kind of things that I was actually observing, just being a person who was just coming to church, just being ordained. So I was reading Cone at a time where I was trying to understand what all of those things meant. And then also I read works by Steve Biko, one of the philosophers in South Africa. So if you talk about Black conscious movement in South Africa, you are definitely talking about Steve Biko. So I read them at a time where actually I was trying to understand those issues. But then there's a sense in which, even though I was reading them, I felt that Black theology of liberation was, in a sense, helpful for me as a Black person, but not helpful for me as a Black woman. So even when, as I was reading, but also observing myself being in a male-dominated space, there was a sense in which I could still feel that Black theology of liberation was not responding to some of the questions that I was posing personally now as a Black woman. So ultimately, I did enroll for a PhD, and I worked with a Black theologian scholar, Professor Vuyani Velem. I think he passed away in December last year, actually.
Anthony mentioned him, I think.
Yes, he did. Yes, he passed away in December last year. So I worked with him. I think it's also important, perhaps, that I mention his role in my life, because actually he inspired me when I was still doing my undergraduate studies in theology. He somehow saw some potential in me. He was that person who was encouraging me that don't stop here, continue with your studies, do your honors, do your masters, do your PhD, and so forth. So I had him to be that kind of a person who encourages me. Because in most instances we study and then we rush and go to church and never really go back to focus on academics. So in a way, he was trying to help me not to go that route, because he was constantly saying, don't rush to church. Just take your time, just study and further your study and so forth. I even remember now when I completed, I think my master's in 2010, he said, don't go to church, because I was like, okay, I'm taking a break from studies, I'm going to church. He said, don't go to church yet. But then I went. So I, in a way, I took a break from studies, and then only enrolled later in 2015, 5 years later. So in a way, he is the first person that really inspired me in this journey, and actually one of the people that are responsible for where I am as now an academic and a researcher and a lecturer at the university. So, but then his works, because he was a Black theologian, his works also I really find interesting. For instance, I think there's I trace it back even from his own doctoral thesis, but then it came across in all his works, how he had a way of bringing some of the, like he used a lot of our language, isiXhosa, because we have about 11 official languages in South Africa. So isiXhosa, which is my home language, is one of the things that he used a lot of concepts from isiXhosa in explaining and expressing his theology. So there's this particular one that I recently reflected on, the crawl, where he speaks about the crawl in his theology. He imagines a crawl in an African home, firstly, is a place where we keep livestock, but also it is a place where we perform rituals. That is an African culture. So whatever that is African culture related, that is the location, the crawl. So it is in a way central in our lives. It is central in our spirituality. Also, the number of livestock that African homes have, in a way, they could be equated to wealth, economy. So it's also important in terms of spirituality, economics, and so forth. So there's a sense that he used that imagery to illustrate how, as Africans and Blacks, we have this important resource, which is the crawl. Because in the crawl also, like for instance, when we are doing rituals in African homes, rituals that connect us to our ancestors, because then our worldview is like that. We believe that our departed loved ones, they are still in a way amongst us, even in spirit. So there's a sense in which we have a space like the crawl where when we perform certain rituals, we connect with them in that space. We do a lot of things in that space, things that are life affirming. So he used that in his theology to say, for instance, he critiqued a lot of Eurocentric epistemologies to say, as Africans, we do not really need to start from the West. That's a theme that comes from it. We don't really have to start there. We have our own resources as Africans. We can start, I think Cole also said this a lot of times, that we can be Black and Christian at the same time. We don't have to cease, for instance, to be Africans in order to be Christians. Yes, so there's a sense in which now this idea of the crawl comes in to say, this is our resource, this is our starting point, this is who we are as Africans. We do not have to throw this away in order for us to be Christians. We can be Africans and Christians at the same time. So in a way, him and Mercy Oduyoye, Mercy Oduyoye is one of the pioneers in theologies that...
Can you possibly spell his name? Because when I do the subtitles, I'd like to get them correct.
Oh, which one should I spell now?
Well, the first one I think I've got from Anthony, but if you could just spell the person you just said.
Okay, it's Mercy, that's Mercy.
Okay.
Oduyoye, Oduyoye, Oye.
Brilliant. And it's also because people that are listening might want to look him up, you see. Is it a he?
Yes.
He, yeah.
It's a she, no, it's a she.
Oh, sorry, she. Yes.
She is a pioneer in the development of a theology that speaks to African women's experiences.
Okay.
So she's a key person when we talk about women's theology in Africa. She's from Ghana. She's not from South Africa. She's from Ghana. But then her work it cuts across. She was one of the people who inspired a lot of women in Africa in doing theology. So I think Mercy Oduyoye was recommended. Now, when I was starting my PhD, it was the first source that was recommended that I just read, so that I understand perhaps also where I wish to go with these questions that I have. So Oduyoye, she reflects on African culture in her writings and religion. So in a way, what I've really found helpful in her work is how she helped me to understand who I was, both as an African and as a woman. So there's a sense in which her reflection on culture helped me to locate myself in an African culture. But what I liked also about her reflections is how she was critical of African culture, even though she embraces African culture, but she was critical of African culture. I think in a way she inspired us to read it as such, to accept what is positive, but to reject what is negative, in some instances, the patriarchal aspects of our culture. In fact, I believe that each and every culture has those elements. So in a way, she was, yeah. So she helped me to be able to see those. From the people that I mentioned now, like James Cone, Steve Biko, Vianney Velem, Mercy Oduyoye. Remember the initial questions that I have of these contradictions and so forth. So in a way, some things were becoming clearer. I was able to identify myself as this African womanist.
Is that how you would describe your theology as African womanist?
But actually, I do not put Africa, I do not say African womanist, but I say womanist in Africa.
Oh, okay. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Because womanist, did it begin in America? Is it basically African Americans that began the idea of womanist theology?
Actually, when I started with my own like research and questions, I was inspired by Alice Walker. From the United States, her definition of womanism. But interestingly, as I was proceeding with the research, I discovered a Nigerian novelist. I'll have to spell that one for you, Chikwenye Ogunyemi. I think I wrote it somewhere. So it's Chikwenye Ogunyemi.
Yeah, I know I've come across that, I think.
Yes. Actually, she when I discovered her work, she actually coined womanism also in the same time as Alice Walker in 1985.
Without consulting?
No.
Wow, that's
actually in that article she even says it herself that she was actually surprised to actually read about Walker and so forth. So it was actually very interesting to discover her, because I had not known about her before, but the popular one that was recommended and so forth was Alice Walker, who comes from the United States. So in a way, I think I'm bringing the issue of the location here, because one of the things that I came across is how this location between these two scholars, Alice Walker and Ogunyemi, one in North America and one in Africa, both coining the same term, but the other one was more prominent, and the other one actually you had to dig in order to actually find that there is a Chikwenye Ogunyemi somewhere who's talking about womanism and so forth. And so in a way, in as much as we womanism, I think it's some sort of a critique in womanist discourses, the issue of class and the issue of location, because for instance, a womanist in North America would be more prominent than a womanist in Africa, because of the location and the geopolitics of knowledge. So I think it's something that I'm constantly aware of, even as I continue to work, this constant critique of our own shortcomings, even in our own discourses. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that Chikwenye Ogunyemi does with her womanism is that she started with womanism, but then she modified it to African womanism. And then her critique was that in as much as she agrees with some of the issues that are raised by Alice Walker in her own definition, she feels like she says it, the African American womanism, that's how she puts it in her paper, it overlooks African peculiarities. So in a way, she brings in African so that then she can be able to expand it and to address some of what she feels like is missing from her own African context. But also, in South Africa, we have some womanists actually who have been inspired by Alice Walker. But then what they would do in such instances, they would try to appropriate it in their own context, try so that it responds to some of the questions that they are raising. For instance, Masinya Madibwane, she's a professor at UNISA. She's a biblical scholar as well. And what she did She also says she's a womanist, but then she coined, she's Tswana, that's her home language, Tswana. So she coined the term Busadi. Busadi is a Tswana name for womanhood. So in a way, in appropriating what Alisoka is bringing, she somehow used her own language, her own Tswana culture as well, so that also then it could then respond to some of the questions that are unique to Tswanas. But then you would also
specificities of the culture, yeah, because the culture in in the United States for Black women is probably quite different. The experience is quite different from, and actually within different African countries, I suspect it's quite different as well. The
actually, I can never
a long history of white and black kind of white racism against so that's quite different maybe from other countries in Africa, or at least not to the same extent maybe. But of course,
yes, it is. It is
colonialism. Then.
It is actually different, because even I'm careful when I talk about African culture. I'm also very careful because it's actually different even in South Africa alone. So I can never be saying African culture and claim to represent the African continent. That's the first. But then you come to South Africa alone. I mentioned 11 official languages. Those are languages of different tribes in Africa. So even in our own country, we have different tribes. So our understanding of African culture, it differs by tribes, but also even in isiXhosa, if I then come back to me as a Xhosa, it also differs. What we do at home may not necessarily be something that is done in another home, and so forth. So there are always those differences which we should always be, I guess, conscious of, so we can never really claim to be representing all Africans when we talk about African culture. There will always be different questions that are raised. For instance, Chikwenye Ogunyemi would certainly raise questions that I am not familiar with, which she is familiar with from her own Nigerian culture, even though we both see ourselves as womanists in Africa and so forth. So there are those kind of differences that we are constantly engaging on.
It's really interesting, and it reminds me of when I spoke to Evie Vernon just a couple of days ago, who was the third theologian I spoke to just before you, and she was saying that one of the terms that she and some other Jamaican, because she's Jamaican, although she lives in the UK now, she's Jamaican, theologians use is nanny-ish, and it's basically like womanist theology. It's Black feminist theology, but it's also nanny was somebody that was a Jamaican hero, the nanny of the Maroons. So they say nanny-ish sometimes now as well. So it's kind of that specificity, isn't it? It's a similar kind of idea.
Yes.
To make it more relevant to your own specific culture, but taking ideas from those other things that have come before, or from other places. Great. Okay, so I was in fact the next question was about that, which is I think we've answered that one. I think we've pretty much answered that, haven't we? Because I've said in the next question that Evie Vernon describes herself as nanny-ish, and maybe is there some kind of an equivalent in Africa? And I think you've already said that there are equivalents of from different cultures and different countries, words that are used.
Yes, they are.
I think you've answered that. Do you want to say anything more on that?
Well, what I could say, because I think I actually, when before we actually ended up going to that question, I wanted to actually bring something about womanism, how it ended up being a space where I got to then engage Black theology of liberation, because in my own research, my thesis is entitled A Womanist Dialogue with Black Theology of Liberation in the 21st Century.
Mm-hmm.
So so I still remember I said in the beginning that I could still find Black theology of liberation helpful as a Black person because my struggle first is that I'm a Black person, so I relate to other Black people and our strives and so forth. But then my questions that that come from me being a woman, I think they then somehow take, I think they stretch a bit, they push some boundaries in Black theology of liberation, because then I think I'm able, as I engage, because when I read Black theology of liberation, from mostly South African scholars like Itumeleng Musala. He's one of the prominent Black theologians in South Africa. There's a sense in which him, I think already in the 1980s, and also Takadzo Mufokeng, amongst others, there's a sense in which they got to see how they've actually neglected the liberation of women. So in their quest to liberate Black humanity, because that's what Black theology is about. They're talking about liberation, Black people from oppression, from systems that are colonialism, slavery, and so forth and so forth. So, but then as one analyzes this idea of Black humanity, there's a sense in which Black humanity becomes Black humanity only through the eyes of men. There are gaps that they picked up themselves as Black theologians in South Africa in the 1980s. But then, interestingly, in as much as they picked it up, but nothing was really done about it. They saw that patriarchy is a problem for Black theology of liberation, but then a lot of them, they saw it, but then at that time, the priority, I think when I say this, I also remember one of the prominent women in South Africa, Brigalia Bam, I think in her speech, I think a year ago when we were celebrating women on the 9th of August, women that they marched at the time of apartheid to the union buildings to challenge the government and so forth. So every year in South Africa on the 9th of August, we commemorate those women. So she was speaking I think a year ago as a keynote speaker in celebrating these women. And she mentioned in her presentation that there's a sense in which our oppression as Blacks was actually more pressing, if I put it that way, more pressing than us being oppressed as women. So she was saying that at that time, what was more urgent and what became the focus. She's not a theologian, it's not a theologian, it's a country. So the struggle in the country felt that so they privileged the liberation of Blacks as a whole. But then she was then remarking that, but then what she sees now happening, now that you are in this democratic country and so forth, she feels like there is a little bit of awareness, even though there are gaps still in terms of addressing inequalities between male and females in South Africa. So that's what you would hear when they reflect about the struggle in the country, but then also that's what you would get in theology in South Africa. That's what also they privileged. That's what was prioritized, the liberation of Black humanity as a whole. But then Takato Mufugeng, he says it also in his, I think, in the 1980s already, that, but the issue is, how can they ignore the oppression of women when actually women were in the forefront of the struggle? Because it's not like women were not there. They've always been there. They've always been there. So their cries and struggles, they have always been there. They were not hidden. But then there's a sense in which still the Black theology of liberation privileged race and class in their analysis. So what I did in my own research and reading of Black theology of liberation and Black consciousness movement was to then argue that actually, yes, race is a problem, yes, class is a problem, but also patriarchy is a problem. So in a way, I'm bringing it also so that it also becomes some sort of a priority, that patriarchal violence, it is equally a fragmenting evil in our Black humanity. So that's how I have that's what I've been reflecting on in my research, but also as a teacher of spirituality, because I am employed by the Department of Christian Spirituality. So I teach spirituality. So in a way, I approach spirituality through those lenses. Those are the kind of questions that I ask. My premise, I always lived experiences of Black women, because they have always been marginalized. So I start there. I ask such questions, about their own spirituality, their own epistemology. But also, what I like about, I think, womanist theology, which is why I chose womanist theology, is the fact that that element of intersectionality, it critiques all these constructs of oppression, but also not only to liberate women. I think I actually love, that's what really drew me to womanist theology. It's not only about liberating women, but it's also about liberating, I think, that's what you would find in Walker's definition. That's what you would find in Ogunyemi's definition, the liberation of people as a whole, which I really find inspiring. So my humanism is mostly inspired by Chikwenye, Ogunyemi, and the scholar that I mentioned earlier, Mercy Oduyoye, who is the founder of African women's theologies, in Africa. So that I'm inspired by them, but still I call myself a womanist, not an African womanist. But then I always, when I have to, I say a womanist in Africa.
Yeah. And is that because you want to be in solidarity with womanists everywhere in the world? Is that the main reason why you wouldn't say African womanist, you'd say womanist, first of all?
Yeah, I think actually you are raising an important point, because I think for me, the cry for women, liberation, it's much, like, it's everywhere. It's a global problem. So in a way, I do identify with womanists in the United States. I do identify with womanists in all parts of the globe. But then when I come into the area of focus, then that's where then you would see the peculiarities, the African peculiarities, me reflecting on African culture and so forth and so forth. So there's a sense in which there is that element of solidarity, which actually I'm comfortable with.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's great. Just moving on to a completely, well, not completely different, of course it's all linked, but a slightly different, on a different tack. The next question was about the Black Lives Matter movement, and I wonder if you've been following it, whether it's been at all kind of in the news, or if anything has been happening in South Africa to do with this. I don't know, I have no idea. But what, you know, if you've noticed that it's happening, what do you think about it? Do you think that it's a really important movement? Do you think that it's going to have an effect? And what is your hope for, you know, the changes that might be made in the world?
Mm-hmm. Actually, it is happening in South Africa as well. I think sometime last month, the South African Council of Churches, they organized actually a protest. So some clergy, I was part of them, some clergy, we had a silent protest in some church where actually others were even wearing signposts that Black Lives Matter. But then they were not only looking at the issue of George Floyd, there were incidences in South Africa that had also sparked such debates and called for the protest. So, but we have been reflecting on it with some colleagues, this movement, Black Lives Matter. But then we started when, in our reflection, which was not long ago, the first person that came to mind when we were thinking about Black Lives Matter is, and especially in relation to George Floyd, was Franz Fanon, what he said in the 1960s. I think that his quote is very popular. When we revolt, it is not for a particular culture, he says. We revolt simply because, for many reasons, we can no longer breathe. So in a way, we started there, and we felt like, okay, this was said already in the 1960s. And also, if we go to our own South African Steve Biko, he echoed the same sentiments in the 1970s. And then also when we read and do Black Theology of Liberation, they've been saying this because Black Theology of Liberation is premised by the non-person, the oppressed, which in our case are Black people. So Black Lives Matter, and the issue for us is they have always mattered. So what we see in George Floyd is that he made the world to listen, or maybe to see what many have always been saying, that we cannot breathe from racist systems of knowledge, of spirituality, amongst other things. So we felt that the recent incident, it somehow points, because if we trace it back to the 60s or even before, these kind of questions and critiques and movements. So in a way, we feel that George Floyd's incident, it points to how rigid racism is, and many constructs of oppression in the globe, not only because in South Africa, we've always been very conscious of that if you think about apartheid and the segregation. But then somehow there's a sense in which it opened what was perhaps hidden, what is an issue for the globe. It is a challenge for the globe. And what we are hoping for, as we also, in a way, we feel like we are part of it, is still very much important, that we continue to firstly ask and these questions and push these boundaries. So we are hoping that perhaps through George Floyd and this movement now, people actually being more aware perhaps than before, that somehow it will make the need to address these issues an urgent one. That is our hope, because it is constantly a problem it's not an event. It's just something that continues to be part of us, even if at times perhaps we turn a blind eye, even if at times we would rather not talk about, even in our own corners or spaces, but it somehow, it really kind of exploded the reality that just like, for instance, in South Africa currently, the pandemic, COVID-19, when I listen to analysts and political analysts, especially on the news and so forth, so they feel that the pandemic, it actually exposed most of the inequalities in South Africa. So there's a sense in which George Floyd perhaps is once again opening that can, that it has always been there, but then it's very easy to just, I actually, if I can just reflect on my own context in South Africa, there's a sense in which things explode and we pay attention, but then they die away and we move to something new and so forth. So I'm also hoping that this movement will fill those gaps and actually address our own habits of just leaving things hanging, just being excited for a moment and then just letting them go. Because if it doesn't now, chances are you will have this interview 10 years later and you will still be talking about Black Lives Matter. We'll still be talking about how racism is still a challenge in the globe and so forth. So there's a sense in which we really, at some point in time, we need to just deal with issues and not hide them or sugarcoat them or whatever you would want to call it. So I am hopeful that perhaps it would, because in fact the responses even by companies. I think I follow some of these companies on Instagram, companies in the United States, some changing policies, some changing a lot of things. So such things, they really make one hopeful that perhaps one day we will overcome and some of these issues. So we continue to be hopeful.
I was actually watching a program that's on at the minute that's actually, it's not about Black liberation, but it's about feminist liberation and the movements in the 70s in America. And they sang that song, We Shall Overcome. You know, that, yeah, it seems to be sung everywhere where there is a movement that needs to,
yeah, right.
gets people going. I've sung it a few times on a couple of protests I've been on, I remember. It's a good song. No, we shall overcome one day.
Yes, we are hopeful indeed.
And there does seem to be,
if we do not hope, then what can we do? I think life without hope is a miserable life. I think it's better that we continue to be hopeful and indeed perhaps things will be better someday.
Yeah, it's about the mix of being realistic and critical, but also hopeful, isn't it? It's having those that balance. And I do think you're right in that there has been an awakening, I think, that we haven't seen before, and that is a hopeful sign. You know, that you see these companies actually saying, wow, this actually has made us think this is the last straw. And Dwight Hopkins was talking about why that might be, and he was saying that he thought the video of George Floyd was so visceral, and people just hadn't seen something so horrendous before, you know, and it kind of just snapped people, especially white people, I think. I mean, we're the people that need snapping out of the reverie, you know, thinking nothing's happening. So the awakening is important, and I hope it continues, like you say. and become something concrete.
Yes, we are hopeful.
Yeah. Now you mentioned quite a few. I might have to come back to you and get you to email me with the names so I don't get the spellings wrong in them. But I've got a few written down. But I wonder if you could just mention. You've mentioned some theologians, but maybe you could mention some. Give some kind of an idea of some books that you think are worth reading. Maybe by these theologians, or maybe by others, and maybe by you if you've written books or papers that might be accessible and good for our supporters to read. Have you got a list of a few things that would be good to read?
Yes, actually, I think on my side, I would recommend my PhD thesis because it's accessible online, and in a way it covers some of the things that we briefly reflected on. So I know that people can't read the whole thesis, but then you would certainly be perhaps drawn to a chapter in Womanist Theology. That's where I actually bring in this Alice Walker, Chikwenye Ogunyemi, and other womanist theologies, and how I ended up settling for what I settled for, and so forth. And also there, how I read and critique Black consciousness movements and Black theology of liberation, womanism, feminism, and so forth. So I would recommend that. But then my articles are accessible online. For instance, I've got this article that I wrote in memory of James Cone. That is easily accessible online. I think if you just type the name like Fundiswa Kobo, then it takes you to ResearchGate or any other.
Maybe on Google Scholar as well.
Yes, Google Scholar, yes, you would be able to access all of them. Also, I actually wrote an article in honor of Messi Oduyoye, but it's coming later this year. Also an article in honor, in remembrance or memory of my supervisor is coming later this year. But I would perhaps recommend, I mentioned Messi Oduyoye, but there are just two books that actually I enjoyed reading. She has written a lot, but then there's a book, it's called Daughters of Anowa. Actually, I found it, and also the other one is Beads and Strands, Reflections of an African Woman on Christianity in Africa. So, so those two books, in a way, they would help one to have some sort of an understanding of how women in Africa do theology, especially their reflection on culture and theology, trying to be African and Christian at the same time. But also Steve Biko's I Write What I Like is very, I think it's highly recommended.
I've come across his name. I wonder if it's because I've been studying theology. I wonder if he's come up maybe on some of the courses. I've definitely heard the name Steve Biko before.
Yes, he's very prominent.
And what are some of his books? Can you kind of name a few? Because it might ring a bell as well for me.
No, I think the prominent one is actually I Write What I Like. He passed away actually very young, so that's just one main book that he actually wrote when he was still alive. It reflects on his journey in the struggle, and then that's Steve Biko, and then. Of course, I would recommend works by some Black theologians in South Africa. I think I mentioned my supervisor, Vianney Velem, but there's also Tenyiko Maluleke. I think I'll send you also.
Yeah, you might have to send
some. Yes, I'll send them. Tenyiko Maluleke, Rothni Chaka, but also womanists in South Africa. The one I mentioned who actually coined the term Busadi, Madibone Masinya, that I would recommend. Sarojini Nada, I would recommend. So those are just basically some works that could actually help someone who was outside South Africa to understand the kind of questions we are grappling with in South Africa and in our theologies.
That's wonderful. Thank you. I'm sorry, I'm being very white with struggling with these names. I'm just not familiar with the spellings, and it's much better if you write it to me and then I can get it right.
No, I understand. It's okay. I will send them to you, all the names, so that people can easily look them up. Because I think most of these names, if you just go to Google Scholar, you are able to access most of their works. So it will not really be a challenge.
Brilliant. Good. Yeah, no, a lot is available freely online, actually. I find that when I'm doing my own research for my MA in theology, yeah. Brilliant. Okay, so I think we've pretty much got through all of those questions I had written down. There was just one that came in on Twitter, and if you're up for it, you could try and answer it. So it's just somebody's asking about the kind of racist theology, like the idea of the mark of Cain, which has been used to justify apartheid and slavery and all this kind of thing, and just kind of asking how we might combat this bad theology, this kind of harmful theology, and whether maybe your theology that you're doing with alongside others in South Africa is part of that combating that you're doing.
Okay, I think I'll briefly respond to that. I think one of the names I would mention is Alan Boesak. He is one of the Black theologians in South Africa. I think he's one of the scholars who actually reflected a lot on the theological justification of apartheid in South Africa. In fact, when he critiques racism and all these constructs of oppression, he says what made South African situation more unique was how segregation, racism was actually justified by theology. And then there are a lot of Black theologians who have actually analyzed how certain biblical texts were used to justify why there should be why the white race should be superior, and why the Black race should be inferior. So Black theology does actually reflect a lot on such theologies, so the issue that came at some point, there were discussions on whether the problem is perhaps with the Bible, because if we are unable to go to the Bible and be able to use it in such a manner, such toxic theologians, you would find then others saying, actually, no, then the Bible is a problem, and so forth. So there's been a lot of engagement actually around these issues. But then Alan Boesak is the one who actually critiques it more and talks about alternatives in terms of biblical interpretations, because the issue, I think, is something that you would hear from most biblical scholars, even in South Africa. The issue is how the Bible is interpreted, and it depends on who is interpreting the Bible. So I think many scholars, I think I'm even thinking of Gerald West, is also, they talk about the Bible as either a tool that oppresses or a tool that liberates. So there's a sense in which Black theology of liberation, we refuse. I mean, as Africans, we are known to be highly religious and very spiritual people. So the Bible is very central in our lives. So I think we have not reached a point where we would just remove the Bible from our lives. But what we grapple with, I guess, is the question of interpretation, trying to find interpretations that are life-affirming. I think that is what has been very popular in the country, as somehow a critique and also a response to how the Bible has been used in the past to justify oppression and all these other constructs that are not life-affirming. So that's just my brief reflection on that. There have been scholars that have reflected on that, especially biblical scholars, the hermeneutics and so forth. That's how they feel like we could actually find ways of using the same text to liberate ourselves instead of just throwing it away.
It's that whole hermeneutic of suspicion thing, isn't it, from liberation theology? So that I think in answer to this person, this man who asked this question on Twitter, how do we combat this bad teaching, this bad theology on the mark of Cain, etc., that justifies racism, basically, and terrible practices like apartheid and slavery in the past? I guess the answer is, to have a hermeneutic of suspicion, so to be suspicious of those interpretations and why they've been kind of put forward, because probably actually the prejudice comes before the biblical, and why is it being interpreted that way? And also then to do, maybe the answer is to do better theology and to do Black theology, and for all of us to do Black theology as well, white people to read Black theology as well and get engaged in it and do anti-racist work as well, if you see what I mean.
Yes.
I can't remember where it was that I read, but there was a Black theologian that was saying basically white people need to start engaging with Black theology and actually, not thinking it's only for Black people to talk about race.
But what I find interesting about what you just mentioned now, I think I remember sometime last year I had to stand in and teach some students. I was standing in for a colleague, and obviously to teach Black theology. And some of the questions actually that came from the students that are white was, is this still relevant? Like, because then I recommend the names that I mentioned to you. So those are some of the sources we're dealing with in class. So how they were critiquing racism and so forth. So for them, actually, they were not sure if this Black theology was important and this Black theology was actually relevant. So I was jokingly, I actually pushed it back to them to say, but is Karl Barth relevant? And then they started looking at me, and then I'm like, if you're going to start asking about theologies that are relevant, perhaps you should just ask all of these theologies, not just select one that you're not comfortable with. We should just have a way of actually just, so in a way, those questions, they also made me see how actually some people actually respond to Black theology of liberation. Some they just dismiss when they hear about Black theology of liberation. Some do engage, I must say, but then I've experienced some who just feel like there is no need, or it is not relevant and so forth. So I guess it is something that we would have to think more forward if we want to address some of the challenges that we are facing as humanity.
No, I think you put your finger on it, didn't you? That a lot of white people have that discomfort, and don't want to talk about race because it makes us uncomfortable, and so we're kind of we'd rather ignore it. And also the second thing I think is that we don't have to. We don't engage because we don't have to, because it actually we benefit you know.
Oh yeah.
In the end, we're not the ones that actually have to liberate, you know, that feel like we have to be liberated, because it doesn't affect us in that way. Although all of us should be bound up together, shouldn't we? So that's why we should care. It's the solidarity thing, you know.
Yes. Yes, you're right.
So tell your students from me, your white students, that they should care because of solidarity.
I will do that.
And tell them that they're very fortunate to have you as their tutor. Thank you so much for being with us. I think we've asked all the questions and you've been brilliant. So I'm going to let you go, because I think we've been talking for over an hour and you must be tired. And it's
it's over an hour. Actually, I was just enjoying it. Thank you so much.
It's really, really lovely. I'm really enjoying this series a lot. So thank you so much for coming and being part of it.
Thank you so much.
And I will definitely get those spellings off you. So I don't
yes.
Thank you. It's nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Thank you so much.
Take care, Fundiswa.
Bye.